I'm absolutely right. Indeed, you know. The bird is very thirsty. It wants water.
There is a fire in Iran. The protests that started after the news of Mahsa Amani's death and are still ongoing have resonated in many parts of the world. When the most important figures of Iran's art and sports community joined the protests, support for the freedom-loving Iranian people increased, and university students in the country also rose up. In response to the protests against interference in lifestyle and clothing, the state has activated all its ideological apparatus. The question on everyone's mind is, what will happen in Iran? In fact, this question was also asked 49 years ago, right during the Shia Islamic Revolution. And it was asked on a theater stage in Istanbul, in a play that begins with the line, "There is a fire in Iran." In the 1980s, theater audiences in Istanbul had developed a habit of watching a particular play repeatedly. There were those who attended the same play dozens of times, memorizing its lines and singing its songs in groups of friends. The play, written, directed, and performed by Ferhan Şensoy, was a feast for ears that had never heard Turkish used so intricately before. The author carefully selected Persian words that had become part of Turkish as a result of centuries of historical exchange between the two languages. And he also coined deep new words with Persian connotations. This method created a unique comedic effect and defined the Ferhangi style that would reflect in all of the author's texts.
Belief is a little dry. The city's oil is little prayer, prayer, prayer. The time of drying does not come, Vaila yesterday's forgetfulness, Vaila yesterday's forgetfulness, Vaila yesterday's forgetfulness.
In the year it was written, 1979, the right-left conflict in Turkey had reached its peak, and the political assassinations and martial law practices that would soon lead the country to a military coup had wearied the society. For this reason, the execution of the character Ömer, who was arrested by the Revolutionary Guards, due to the similarity of his name to Ömer Hayyam, reminded the audience more of their own country than Iran. The play was titled They Would also shoot the Shahs. Just as it was about to be staged again, 40 years after its first performance, theaters were going to close due to the pandemic. Immediately after, Levent Ünsal from the cast passed away. In the same year, we lost Rasim Öztekin, followed by Ferhan Şensoy. The Shahs of theater were also being shot. The modern world first recognized the Shah of Iran between 1925 and 1941. Reza Shah, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, became the commander of the army. With the coup he carried out using the forces that captured Tehran on February 21, 1921. A few years later, he ended the Qajar dynasty's rule and began to establish a new Iran. A similar transformation was simultaneously occurring in neighboring Turkey. While Shah Pahlavi was establishing a strong, unified, centralized, and independent state, he employed the authoritarian rigor found in almost every country of the 1930s, and in modernization, he found a model very close by that he could emulate: Atatürk's Turkey.
We are very pleased and honored to have accepted His Majesty in Turkey, sir. In my life, if I ever looked at a bird, I would consider it a privilege to address someone with such a desire.
Capitulations were abolished in Turkey in 1923 and in Iran in 1928. Secular courts were introduced in Turkey in 1924 and in Iran in 1936. The veil ban, penal code, hat, civil code, co-education, adult schools, titles, and nicknames. The revolutions carried out in the language institution were done either in the same year or a few years apart. The Shia clerics who opposed the new regime were either fleeing to Iraqi territories or hiding in the city of Qom. One of them was Ayatollah Khomeini. During World War II, the Soviet Union and England secured the Iranian front by overthrowing the Shah, who leaned towards the opposing bloc. England still had its way in Iran. The deposed Reza Shah was exiled as far as South Africa, and his son was brought in to replace him. For the young heir who had studied in Switzerland, power came early at the age of 22. Reza Shah had left and Shah Reza had come. A young man passionate about modernization and raised with Western norms had taken the helm of the country. However, it would take some time for him to learn what politics really meant. The young Shah faced his first coup threat in 1953. In 1952, his Prime Minister, Dr. Mossadegh, demonstrated with the support he received from the public that he could overshadow the young Shah. The first political crisis threatening the regime had shaken the throne harshly. The issue was resolved with a military coup supported by the British and Americans, a method fashionable in the Middle East during those years. After 1953, Shah Reza, who had a broader operational field and masses that supported him unquestioningly, even worshipfully, had ascended the throne. He was channeling oil revenues into investments, creating the modern-looking elites of the 1960s. Despite having two marriages, the Shah, who had no heir, married Faradiba at the end of 1959. This elegant and beautiful lady, who studied architecture in Paris, suddenly became the star of the European tabloid press and gave birth to 3 children in succession. In 1963, the Shah named the modernization movement the White Revolution, or Inqilabi Sefed. This aggressive modernization, a series of targeted reforms, was transferring wealth to the working class on one hand, while on the other it was breaking down feudal traditions, leading to rapid economic growth and urbanization. The most significant difference was seen in the increase in literacy. The country was now poised to become a major geopolitical power in the Middle East. Land reform, networks of road, rail and airways, infrastructure and health projects, women's suffrage, and an effort for an independent foreign policy were to be the core moves of the White Revolution. New policies were also being implemented to weaken the control of the clerics. Among these were granting women the right to become lawyers and judges, and raising the minimum marriage age to 15. The new leader of the team working with the Shah was Faradiba. In 1967, she received the title of Shahbanu, or Empress, and began working with full authority to address social issues. The nearly 10% annual economic growth rate was developing the middle class, and geopolitical power was increasing with imported weapons. Persian history was also being used as a tool to enhance the sense of belonging to Iran among the society. There was talk of seeing a brand new Iran in the 70s. It was time to launch this vision. This is how the idea of Persepolis, Budget 2500, was born. In 1971, Shah Reza held a party in the ancient capital of the Persian Empire. The 2500th anniversary of the founding of Persepolis was to be celebrated. Thus, the image of Cyrus, known as a symbol of justice, and the exaltation of Persian civilization would enhance the country's international prestige, and this identification would be magnificent for the Shah. This display of wealth and status, where 60 great deceased countries were represented, was unprecedented. When an emperor, 8 kings, 5 queens, 15 heads of state, generals, dictators, Turks, duchesses, ministers, and prime ministers came together, the world's eyes turned to Iran. As in many Middle Eastern countries, certain dynamics there had clung to the handles of those who gained power. On one side, the army, on the other, the regime's opponents. The task of the team organizing the party was to create a setting that would be presented to the world leaders and showcase Iran's arts, ancient civilization. The challenging part was that this setting needed to look real and be ready by the date of the invitation. A flurry of activity began. As for the spending budget, it was determined to be unlimited. The guests would be hosted in tents, just like in ancient times. A captivating traditional setting would be created by the French company Janssen. Leaving the work to the professionals was the best solution. The world-renowned Parisian restaurant Maxim took on the responsibility for food and drink. In the 5-star tent city set up for the celebration that would last 3 days and 3 nights, every detail was considered, even saplings, to protect the guests from the desert heat were brought from France. As news of the preparations spread across Europe, it was concluded that Shah Reza had established absolute stability in Iran. However, the reality was slightly different.
The Shah, you say, transferring the pension in front of the legality in Sir thermal body, Spanish ability. This, and logically, okay, you said such and such about the assembly and it was taken. Beating culture and distro MP, oh, it holds badly. I mean, Vatu, Leila, Petude appointment. Let's not forget much that earring danced around. Medical record, bucket oil. Bond sex. Tape. To the government's table, hard-headed. Shah.
In the opening speech, he addressed the Persian Emperor Cyrus as follows. "O Cyrus, sleep peacefully. We are constantly vigilant to protect your country." In fact, it couldn't be said that they were very vigilant. The Shah and his close circle had long been disconnected from the people, unable to follow social dynamics, and had secluded themselves in their palaces. The number of people who thought that the Shah's practices were the exact opposite of Persian Emperor Cyrus's was increasing. All the prohibitions thought to provide peace had created an environment that did not allow for dissenting voices. At least, that was what was believed. Savak intelligence agents were raiding the homes of leftists, making arrests without questioning. Courts were operating under orders. Books were being banned. And none of this was reflected in the controlled press. Since rural workers could not benefit from land reform, they found the solution in migrating from villages to cities, and nearly half of the population had become impoverished. By the late 70s, dissatisfaction had spread to the remaining rural areas as well. Mismanagement and unjust practices, corruption and squandered funds led to production not meeting demand. Rising taxes, inflation in the prices of seeds, water, and imported equipment, and disruptions in health and education services increased complaints. The import of agricultural products, primarily from the United States, began to pressure farmers. Universities were up in arms, and the youth had started mocking every word of the Shah. Khomeini was the staunchest opponent of the White Revolution and the Shah. As early as 1963, he opposed the harsh crackdowns on student protests and initiated resistance against the Shah, for which he was arrested after calling him a poor man. The uprising that followed was brutally suppressed, which drew widespread criticism. Now, on one side were the leftists, clerics, and the poorest, and on the other side were the Shah and supporters of modern Iran. Khomeini's voice, never silent in exile, was constantly questioning the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the Persepolis party at every opportunity. The events that led Iran to a new revolution began in 1977, particularly with the demonstrations by university students protesting, the attacks against writers and poets. Initially, modern intellectuals, the bourgeoisie, liberals, journalists, and human rights activists were organizing meetings and raising their voices against all forms of monarchy. When the letter that the Shah wrote to Khomeini at the beginning of '78 was published, the clergy and theology students also organized demonstrations in the city of Qom. This incident, in which many people were injured and lost their lives, united all opposition groups and led to the spread of actions to other cities. As global social and political reform demands brought about the end of the monarchy, the international public was also expecting Iran to break free from its shackles. By the end of the year, the opposition began to take control nationwide, and revolutionary committees were established. Finally, on January 16, 1979, Shah Reza was forced to leave his country with his family. By that day, in demonstrations attended by 35 million people, 3,000 had lost their lives and 12,000 were injured. Khomeini, who emerged as the opposition leader, was supported by the secular segment as a symbol of the uprising, despite being a cleric. Khomeini returned to Tehran as a hero from his Paris exile on a February day in 1979. Among the 2 million people who welcomed him were Iranians from various segments such as students, civil servants, intellectuals, merchants, workers, tradesmen, leftists, and clerics. 10 days later, the revolutionaries took control of the capital, Tehran. The revolution had happened, but what the new regime would be was still uncertain. Iran was in chaos. Shiites had attacked the Kaaba, and Iranian radio interpreted the attack as an American plot. Meanwhile, Ferhan Shensoy was following the developments in Iran, from Istanbul to write the ending of his play. At the end of 1979, students demanding the extradition and trial of Shah Reza stormed the American embassy in Tehran, initiating a hostage crisis. This event also marked the beginning of an unending hostility between Iran and America. The premiere of the play, for which he was the writer, director, actor, composer, and producer, took place on March 18, 1980, at the Yapı Endüstri Merkezi, which is not a theater. Due to the interest the play received, the middle players moved it to a small stage by the end of the year, and it was performed uninterruptedly 586 times during the first half of the 80s. During that period, Turkey's agenda included not only the pressures of September 12th and the transition to democracy, but also concerns about the export of Sharia from Iran. In one scene of the play, Khomeini appears as the nightmare of Shah Reza. At the end of the backgammon game played with giant dice, the mullah had the final word saying, "You need a 7-7, and that hasn't been invented yet." At the beginning of 1986, a covert censorship law that occupied the agenda significantly was introduced as a regulation aimed at protecting minors from erotic content. In response to this, Shensoy wrote and staged the Muzr musical. The musical received significant backlash from conservative circles, and during one performance, 2 people rushed onto the stage and shouted at the audience, "We are all Muslims. Why are you watching this play?" They shouted. As a result of the incident, a lawsuit was filed against Ferhan Shensoy. Threats from the same circles also became more frequent. The number of people saying, "We will burn your theater," increased. Indeed, it didn't take long. On the night of February 7, 1987, after the 77th performance, the Sham Theater suspiciously burned down. The night watchman lost his life in the incident. The incident was never clarified. The court sentenced Shensoy to 21 days in prison. All the shows that the Orta players performed came to an end. Ferhan Shensoy began performing his one-man play Ferhangi Şeyler, which he wrote in the last month on the evening of March 7, 1987. The production, with the lowest possible budget, turned into a new phenomenon as soon as the curtain rose. While he continued to perform that play in 2020, he had already surpassed the 2,500th performance. It was precisely during those days that he left us. In 2009, Shensoy created a sequel to Şahları Vururlar, set in an advanced Iranian atmosphere in Turkey, focusing on the experiences of 2 people named Mustafa and Kemal living underground, which was generally considered exaggerated for Turkey at the peak of opening up. However, the 10 years that followed would show that many of the political oppression parodies in the play came true. In the end, although the play was staged by some amateur groups over the years, it was never performed again by the original players. Until the 11th day of November, 2022. One of Shah Reza's lines was, "If I do not enter paradise, it would be a loss for paradise." Perhaps it should be said, if this play is not watched now, it will be lost to those who cannot see it. Because there is another fire in Iran. It is possible to understand Failatun Failun, and the perpetrator is the perpetrator.
There is a fire in Iran. The fire department is the culprit. The perpetrator is unknown. Your fault is your fault. The perpetrator is not known. Everyone is being arrested, and the perpetrator is the perpetrator. The reason is unknown. Faylatun fascism, don't worry. Too much about Faylatun.